Vesta was the oldest son of Saturn and Rhea, and was the goddess of the family hearth. As the hearth was the basis of all domestic ties, Vesta was considered the guardian of family happiness, and her worship was an essential part of the family life. The hearth in ancient days had a much greater significance than in modern times, for it was the center of the household, around which the family gathered for their common meal and common worship. On the hearth, as an altar fire, the head of the household offered prayers and sacrifices, and it made a bond of union so generally recognized that he who partook of food there, or who shared in the family worship, could ever afterward lay claim to the master's hospitality. If a suppliant was seeking protection from any danger, it was to a man's hearth that he came, as a sure place of refuge. The flames that burned on this family altar were sacred to the goddess Vesta, and prayers for domestic happiness and the household's welfare were usually offered to her. Thus the fire burning on the hearth of each dwelling was a perpetual worship of the beneficent Vesta, and even the sacrifices made to other gods were partly in her honor, for whenever the flames were rekindled a prayer was offered to the goddess of the family fireside. Every dwelling was therefore in some sense a temple of Vesta, but there was also in each city a stately edifice where all the citizens worshipped at her sacred fire, and were thus bound together in one great family. In Rome, where the worship of Vesta was most celebrated, a beautiful circular temple dedicated to the goddess stood in the Forum. It was not necessary to place a statue of Vesta there, for the eternal fire that glowed on her altar was her living symbol, and through this she was worshipped. This fire was supposed to have been brought to Italy by Aeneas when he fled from burning Troy, and carried with him out of the city two valuable possessions, i.e. the fire of Vesta and his own household gods, or Penates. When a colony was sent out from any city, the emigrants took some of the fire from the temple of Vesta in the mother town and guarded it during their voyages, that they might use its flames to light the fires that were to burn on the hearths of the new homes. Each city cherished carefully the fire that was sacred to Vesta, and never allowed it to burn out, for it was an evil omen sure to presage disaster. If by any chance it was allowed to become extinct, it was never relit from any ordinary fire, but was kindled with a spark produced by friction, or by drawing fire from the sun's rays through a glass. The temple at Rome was the most famous of those dedicated to Vesta, for here was the school of the Vestal virgins, whose duty it was to tend her ever-living fire. As any neglect on their part might bring some public calamity upon Rome, this altar was jealously guarded, and when, as it sometimes happened, enemies threatened the city, the Vestals carried the fire of Vesta down the Tiber and kept it in concealment until the danger was over. Since so much depended on the watchfulness and fidelity of the Vestals, the office of priestess to the temple was held in high honor, and the maidens were chosen from the noblest families of Rome. They entered the service at the very youthful age of 6, and spent 30 years in the temple. The first 10 years were devoted to learning their important duties. The next decade was the period for filling the office of priestess and performing all the solemn rites that belonged to the worship of Vesta. The last 10 years were given to instructing the novices. When the 30 years of service were over, the Vestals could continue in the temple or leave it and marry if they desired, but so holy were the virgins thought to become through their long residence in the temple that it was held a sort of sacrilege for any man to marry them. Therefore the priestesses usually died as they had lived, in the service of the goddess. The chief duty of the Vestals was to watch in turns by night and day the sacred fire of Vesta, and to see that the flames never grew dim. During their entire period of service they were obliged to keep the strictest vows of chastity, under penalty of being buried alive in a vaulted room built especially for this purpose by the king Numa Pompilius. The Vestals were, however, so true to all the vows made at the great altar fire that in 1,000 years only 18 failed their promises and thus suffered punishment. The story is told that the Vestal Tuccia was accused of having broken her vow, but was able to prove her purity by being given the miraculous power to carry water in a sieve from the Tiber to the temple. Though the restrictions placed on the Vestals were severe, and the rules of their order were pitilessly enforced, Yet the privileges that they enjoyed were such as to raise them in dignity above the other women of Rome. They were all entirely released from all parental authority. They had conspicuous places at the theatres and gladiatorial shows, and occupied seats of honor at all public festivals. Treaties and important state documents were entrusted to their care as a place inviolable, and their persons were held so holy that when they died they were buried within the city limits, a privilege granted to but few. When they went abroad each was preceded by a lictor, and consuls, praetors, and even tribunes made way for them, while if any one passed under their litter he was put to death. If they chanced to meet a criminal on his way to punishment, they could demand his release, provided that it could be proved that the meeting was accidental. The Vestals wore a robe of pure white linen with a wide purple border, and over their shoulder was a purple mantle. When the festivals of Vesta, the Vestalia, were held, the priestesses marched in a procession through the streets, carrying their sacred fire, while the Roman matrons followed them barefooted, chanting hymns in praise of Vesta. During these ceremonies all work was suspended in the city, the houses were decked with flowers, and the beasts used in the procession were wreathed in garlands. Banquets were set out before the houses, and the people gave themselves up to a gala day. When Ennius fled from burning Troy and took with him some of the fire from the temple of Vesta, as the thing most necessary in the founding of a new city, he also brought to the shores of Italy his own household gods, or penates, who presided over the daily affairs of the household, and were the guardians of each member of the family on whose hearth they held the place of honor. The statues of the penates were of clay, wax, ivory, silver, or gold, according to the master's wealth, and were always carried to the new home when the family changed its dwelling place. When the common meal was served, a small portion of it was set aside for the penates, and a libation of wine was poured to them on the hearth. In return for this daily deference, the penates blessed the household with happiness and prosperity. The Lares were also worshipped by the Roman family, though they were quite unknown to the Greeks. They were the divinities that preserved the family unity, and often were a sort of embodiment of the spirit of its head and founder. The Lares also guarded the welfare of the city, and presided over the fortunes of those great groups of families that were the probable foundation of every Roman town. Tradition tells us that the Lares were the two children of Mercury and a beautiful naiad named Lara. This nymph was so loquacious that she talked from morning to night, and was very fond of prying into other people's affairs, that she might thereby have some new subjects for conversation. One day she heard Jupiter making love to a beautiful wood nymph, and instead of keeping the matter discreetly to herself, she hurried off to tell the whole affair to Juno. This impertinence so angered Jupiter that he determined to punish her severely, and also to prevent her from doing any more tale-bearing, so he had poor Lara's tongue cut off. Then he summoned Mercury and bade him take the nymph to Hades, where the sight of her sad face could never offend his eyes. On the way down to Pluto's kingdom, Mercury fell in love with his fair companion, and instead of leading her into Hades, he took her to a kindlier place, where he soon won her love and persuaded her to be his wife. The two children of Mercury and Lara were called Lares, and to them the Romans paid many honors, reserving for them a place of honor on the family hearth.